Welcome back to a new chapter of Under the Enchanted Sky. I hope you enjoyed this dive into Harry and Hermione's journey. Today, I'm reading chapter 6 to 9. This is my very own story, and it's been so much fun bringing their emotions and untold moments to life. Thank you so much for listening and supporting Eleonora's fan world. And for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the magic. Chapter 6. A Spark in the Dark. The next few days passed in a blur of snow-dusted mornings and cold winter evenings, but for Harry, time seemed to slow whenever he was near Hermione. Their moments together, studying in the library, walking to class, or sitting by the fire, felt heavier now, like every word and every glance carried something unspoken. On one such evening, Harry found himself alone in the Gryffindor common room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Most of the students had gone to bed, and the silence was a welcome change from the usual noise. He leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames, his thoughts inevitably drifting to Hermione. "Still up? Still?" Harry turned, startled, to see Hermione standing in the doorway of the girls' dormitory. She was wearing a thick, oversized jumper and leggings, her hair loose around her shoulder. In the low firelight, she looked softer somehow, less guarded. "Yeah," Harry said, sitting up. "Couldn't sleep." Hermione crossed the room and settled into the chair beside him, tucking her legs beneath her. "Me neither." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crackling fire filled the silence, but Harry could feel the weight of her presence beside him. "Do you want to talk about it?" Hermione asked, her voice gentle. Harry hesitated. "I don't know. Just thinking about everything. Ron, the ball, the tournament." Hermione's brow furrowed, her concern evident. "You've had a lot on your shoulders lately." Harry smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." Hermione reached out, her hand brushing his arm. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt through Harry that he hadn't expected. "Harry," she said softly, her gaze searching his, "you don't have to go through all of this alone. I'm here. I'll always be here." The sincerity in her voice made his chest tighten. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the one thing that keeps me steady." Hermione's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, her hand lingering on his arm a moment longer before pulling back. "I mean it," Harry added, leaning forward. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Hermione's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she met his gaze, her brown eyes wide and unreadable. The air between them seemed to thicken, and Harry became acutely aware of how close they were, how her knees almost touched his, how the firelight danced across her skin. He wasn't sure what came over him, but before he could think better of it, he reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek, warm and soft, and Hermione's breath hitched. "Harry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, pulling his hand back. "No," Hermione said, shaking her head. "Don't be." The silence that followed was almost unbearable, charged with something they both felt but neither dared to name. A winter walk. The next morning, Harry and Hermione decided to take a walk around the castle grounds. The snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the world in white. Hermione had wrapped herself in a scarf that looked far too big for her, and Harry couldn't help but smile at the sight. "What?" Hermione asked, catching his expression. "Nothing," Harry said quickly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You just look cozy." Hermione rolled her eyes, but she smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." As they walked, their conversation turned light, filled with teasing remarks and shared laughter. But as they approached the frozen lake, their steps slowed, and the conversation faded. Hermione knelt by the edge of the ice, brushing snow off a smooth patch. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "Yeah," Harry said, though his eyes weren't on the lake. Hermione glanced up, catching him staring at her. Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "Harry." "Harry." "What?" he asked, his voice soft. "I feel like you've been different lately," she said carefully. "Different how?" "Just more thoughtful." "More," she trailed off, biting her lip. Harry knelt beside her, the snow crunching beneath his weight. "Hermione, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, her breath visible in the cold air. Do you ever think about us? Hermione froze, her eyes widening. What do you mean? Harry hesitated, his heart pounding. I mean, do you ever think about what it would be like if we were more than friends? The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Hermione's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing his. The touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a warmth through Harry that had nothing to do with the weather. I don't know, she admitted finally. But maybe it's time we found out. Harry's breath caught at her words, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. The castle, the snow, the lake, none of it mattered. It was just him and Hermione, their hands brushing, their breaths mingling in the cold air. But before he could respond, a voice called out from the distance, breaking the spell. Oi, Potter! Hermione? They turned to see Ron jogging toward them, his face red from the cold. Harry pulled back quickly, the moment shattered, but the memory of Hermione's words lingered. Time to head in, Ron said, oblivious to the tension. Dinner's starting soon. Hermione stood, brushing the snow from her knees. We'll catch up, she said, her voice steady. As Ron jogged ahead, Harry turned to Hermione. What now? Hermione smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. I guess we take it one step at a time. Harry nodded, but his mind was already racing, his thoughts consumed by the spark they'd just ignited. Chapter 7. The Heat Beneath the Cold. The castle was quiet that evening, the muffled sounds of wind swirling through the snow-covered grounds. Harry had just finished dinner, his mind still replaying Hermione's words by the frozen lake. Maybe it's time we found out. The thought sent a flutter through his chest that was both thrilling and terrifying. He headed to the library, half hoping and half expecting to find Hermione there. Sure enough, she was seated at her usual spot near the back, a candle casting a soft golden glow over her face as she scribbled notes. Her hair spilled over her shoulder in loose waves, and Harry found himself momentarily transfixed. You're staring, Hermione said without looking up, a small smile tugging at her lips. Harry blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. Sorry. Didn't mean to. It's all right, she said, finally glancing up. Come sit. Come sit. He dropped into the chair across from her, trying to ignore the way his heart picked up speed. What are you working on? Arithmancy, she replied, holding up her parchment. But I could use a break. My brain feels like it's turning to mush. Harry grinned. Even Hermione Granger needs a break. I don't believe it. Hermione rolled her eyes but laughed softly. There's a first time for everything. They fell into easy conversation, but as the minutes passed, Harry became increasingly aware of how close they were. The quiet of the library, the soft flicker of candlelight, and the way Hermione's lips curved when she smiled. It all felt too intimate, too charged. At one point, Hermione reached for her quill, her hand brushing his. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through Harry that left his skin tingling. Sorry, she said, pulling her hand back quickly. It's okay, Harry said, his voice quieter now. Really? Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken. Harry could see the faint rise and fall of Hermione's chest, the way her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Hermione, he began, leaning closer. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before he could stop himself, Harry reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was light, tentative, but Hermione didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked on his. Harry's breath hitched as he leaned in, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the warmth of her breath, the closeness of her presence, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped. But just as their lips were about to meet, the sound of footsteps echoed through the library. Someone's coming, Hermione whispered, pulling back quickly. Harry sat back, his heart racing as Madame Pince appeared at the end of the aisle, her stern expression scanning the room. This is a library, she said sharply. Not a common room. Keep your voices down. Sorry, Hermione said quickly, gathering her things. We'll leave. Harry followed her out, his mind still reeling from the near kiss. The tension between them was palpable as they stepped into the corridor, the quiet amplifying the awkwardness. Hermione, Harry began, but she cut him off. Let's not talk about it here, she said, her voice tight. Not now. Harry nodded, though disappointment tugged at his chest. All right. Later, she agreed, though her tone was uncertain. That night. The Gryffindor common room was nearly empty when Harry returned. He dropped into his usual spot by the fire, staring into the flames as his thoughts swirled. The almost kiss had left him shaken, not just because it had been interrupted, but because of how badly he'd wanted it to happen. Harry! He turned to see Hermione standing near the stairs to the girls' dormitory. She was wrapped in a blanket, her hair slightly tousled, and she looked hesitant, almost shy. Couldn't sleep? Harry asked, his voice softer than usual. Not really, she admitted, stepping closer. Can I sit? Of course. She settled into the chair beside him, her blanket falling loosely around her shoulder. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. But then Hermione shifted, her knee brushing against his. The contact was brief, but enough to send a spark through him. About earlier, Hermione began, her voice quiet. In the library. Harry turned to her, his heart racing. Yeah. Hermione hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. But then she looked up, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that made his breath catch. I don't want to leave it like that. What do you mean? He asked softly. She leaned forward slightly, her hand reaching out to rest lightly on his arm. I think we need to stop avoiding what's happening between us. Harry swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. And what is happening between us? Hermione's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, and she moved her hand to his cheek, her fingers warm against his skin. Something I think we both want to figure out. Before he could respond, Hermione leaned in, her touch firm and confident. Her lips brushed his lightly at first, testing, before pressing fully against his. The kiss was warm, soft, and sent a shiver down Harry's spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. When they pulled apart, Harry stared at her, his breath coming in uneven bursts. Hermione. Don't overthink it, Harry, she said, her voice steady but soft. We'll figure it out. Together. He nodded slowly, his hand moving to cover hers. For the first time in weeks, the tension between them seemed to ease, replaced by something new, something both exciting and terrifying. As they sat by the fire, Hermione leaned her head against Harry's shoulder, the crackling flames warming the room around them. For now, neither of them spoke. They didn't. Chapter 8. A Maze of Doubts. The days following their kiss passed in a blur, but for Harry, every quiet moment felt like a battleground in his mind. The memory of Hermione's lips against his, her soft yet confident words, and the way she leaned into him with unshakable certainty replayed over and over. He wanted to hold on to it, but doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest. What if he wasn't enough for her? What if he ruined everything, this fragile, beautiful thing they had begun, and lost his best friend in the process? The thought haunted him as he trudged across the snowy grounds toward Hagrid's hut, where care of magical creatures was about to start. He spotted Hermione ahead, her hair catching the pale winter sunlight, and his chest tightened. Harry, she called, turning to wave him over. Hey, he said, forcing a smile as he caught up to her. You all right? She asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Yeah. Why wouldn't I be? Hermione's brow furrowed, but before she could press the issue, Ron appeared behind them, loudly complaining about the cold. Bloody freezing, isn't it? You'd think Hagrid would hold these lessons indoors for once, Ron grumbled. Harry nodded absently, grateful for the distraction but painfully aware of the way Hermione glanced at him, her concern lingering. The common room that night. Later, Harry found himself in his usual spot by the fire, staring into the flames as his thoughts churned. The common room was quieter than usual, most students having turned in early after a long day. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and ran a hand through his hair. What am I doing? He thought. Hermione deserves better than me. Someone who can give her the kind of relationship she deserves, not someone who's constantly caught up in danger, who doesn't even know if he'll survive the year. Harry! He turned to see Hermione standing behind him, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. She stepped closer, sitting down beside him on the couch. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. "No," Harry said quickly, though he knew she wouldn't buy it. "I'm fine." Hermione didn't look away, her eyes searching his. "Harry, I know you. Something's been bothering you since—" She hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Since the other night." Harry felt his stomach twist. "Hermione, it's not you. It's just everything." "Everything?" she echoed, her tone soft but edged with curiosity. Harry sighed, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I don't want to mess this up. Us. I don't even know if I can give you what you want." Hermione frowned, leaning slightly closer. "What makes you think that?" Harry hesitated, struggling to put his thoughts into words. "I don't exactly have a great track record when it comes to relationships. And with everything going on, the tournament, Voldemort, I don't know if I can handle this too." Hermione was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on him. Then she reached out, placing her hand lightly on his arm. "Harry, do you honestly think I expect everything to be perfect?" He looked at her, startled by the conviction in her voice. "We've been through so much together," she continued, her hand tightening slightly on his arm. "Do you think I don't understand what you're dealing with? That I haven't thought about the risks?" Harry opened his mouth to respond, but Hermione cut him off. "I know what I'm getting into, Harry, and I'm not afraid of it." Her words struck him like a bolt of lightning, the certainty in her gaze melting away some of the doubt that had been weighing him down. Harry trailed off, his voice faltering. Hermione's expression softened, and she moved her hand to his cheek, her touch warm and grounding. "You're overthinking this, as usual." A faint smile tugged at Harry's lips. "Maybe I am." Hermione smiled back, her eyes twinkling in the firelight. "We'll figure it out. Together, together." Her words were like a balm, soothing the raw edges of his worry. For the first time in days, Harry felt a glimmer of hope. Later that night, Hermione had gone to bed, leaving Harry alone by the fire. He leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling as her words replayed in his mind. She wasn't afraid. Of the risks, of the challenges, of him. A small smile broke across his face as he realized how absurd his doubts had been. Hermione wasn't someone to be underestimated. She had chosen him, with all his flaws and uncertainties, and she wasn't going to let him push her away. With that thought, Harry finally felt his shoulders relax. Tomorrow, he decided, he would stop second-guessing. Chapter 9. Convincing Touches. The next day was bright and clear, the snow outside glittering under the pale winter sun. Harry found himself restless, pacing the empty Gryffindor common room as his thoughts circled endlessly. He was still grappling with Hermione's words from the night before, their mix of certainty and affection, a sharp contrast to his lingering doubts. "Harry?" Hermione's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. He turned to see her descending the stairs, her hair slightly mussed as if she'd been lying down, and a determined expression on her face. She wore a simple jumper and jeans, her casual appearance doing nothing to diminish the authority in her gaze. "Hi," Harry said awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sit," Hermione said, motioning to the couch by the fire. "We need to talk." Harry hesitated but did as she asked, dropping onto the couch and watching as she settled beside him, tucking one leg beneath her. She turned to face him, her expression both serious and kind. "You've been avoiding me," she said bluntly, "and I want to know why." Harry sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not avoiding you. I'm just trying to figure things out." "Figure what out?" she pressed. "Everything," Harry admitted. Us. "I don't want to screw it up, Hermione. You mean too much to me." Hermione's expression softened, but there was a glint of determination in her eyes. "Harry, you're not going to screw this up. You know why? Because I'm not going to let you." Before he could respond, she shifted closer, her knee brushing against his. Harry felt his breath catch as she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know you're scared," she said, her voice gentler now. "I am too, in some ways. But Harry, we've faced things most people can't even imagine. Do you really think we can't handle this? Harry looked down at their joined hands, her fingers warm and steady against his. It's not just about handling it, he said quietly. It's about not losing you. If this goes wrong, it won't, Hermione interrupted firmly, because we'll make sure it doesn't. But you have to stop doubting yourself. I chose you, Harry, and I don't regret it. Her words sent a wave of warmth through him, but it was the way she leaned in that truly made his heart race. Hermione's hand moved to his cheek, her touch light but deliberate as she tilted his face toward hers. You're overthinking again, she murmured, her lips curving into a small smile. Harry's pulse quickened as her thumb brushed his cheek, her gaze unwavering. Maybe, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Well, Hermione said softly, leaning closer, let me help you stop. Before Harry could process her words, Hermione closed the distance between them, her lips pressing against his. The kiss was different this time, bolder, more deliberate, as if she were determined to erase every ounce of doubt lingering in his mind. Harry responded instinctively, his hand moving to her waist as he pulled her closer. The warmth of her body against his sent a shiver down his spine, and he felt her fingers tangle in his hair, anchoring him to the moment. When they finally broke apart, Hermione didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. See? She whispered, her voice teasing but tender. Not so hard, is it? Harry laughed softly, the tension in his chest easing for the first time in days. Not when you put it like that. Hermione smiled, her fingers still playing lightly with his hair. Good, because I'm not letting you go. The words sent a jolt of electricity through Harry, and he found himself leaning in again, capturing her lips in another kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the warmth and certainty of her presence. As the fire crackled beside them, Hermione shifted, her hand sliding from his cheek to his neck. Her touch was light but firm, sending a trail of warmth wherever her fingers grazed. Harry's hand moved tentatively along her back, his fingers brushing the curve of her waist. Hermione's breath hitched slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed closer, her movements unhurried but intentional, as if she wanted to savor every moment. Harry, she murmured against his lips, her voice low and breathless. You don't have to hold back. Her words sent a surge of confidence through him, and he let his hands move more freely, tracing the line of her spine. Hermione responded with a soft hum of approval, her fingers tightening slightly in his hair. It wasn't until the sound of laughter echoed faintly from the corridor that they broke apart, both of them breathing heavily. Hermione's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright as she looked at him. I think we should head upstairs before someone walks in, she said, her tone light, but still tinged with the intensity of the moment. Yeah, Harry agreed, though he couldn't stop the grin spreading across his face. Hermione stood, smoothing her jumper and offering him her hand. Come on, Potter. You've got a lot to learn about trusting me. Harry took her hand, letting her pull him to his feet. As they walked toward the stairs, he couldn't help but marvel at how effortlessly Hermione had dismantled his doubts, replacing them with something far more powerful, hope.